you very much for this great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite places to be. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. And given that I'm originally from Istanbul, my standards are very high, so this is an amazing place. And I'm very happy to be talking to all these amazing and very distinguished set of central bankers on a topic that is not obviously dear to my heart, but I believe also dear to your hearts, many of you in this audience. Monetary policy transmission in emerging and Latin American economies. I would like to start by asking 3 questions. Do monetary policy making and its transmission differ in developed versus developing countries? So should we be thinking about this issue differently in United States, United Kingdom, Euro area, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Turkey? And if that is the case, if we should be thinking differently about this issue, why that is? And what role do US policies, specifically all US policies, of course, but US monetary policies play in this set of questions. I would like to start from the very basic fact that we all know in this room, that emerging economies are largely exposed to fluctuations in external financing conditions. It is very easy for me to tell you this because this is also your starting position in your own policymaking frameworks. And you would also believe me when I tell you it is actually sometimes difficult to explain this to my American colleagues in the United States of America who has done monetary policy only thinking their own domestic economies. Now, when we start from this issue that emerging economies are exposed to external financing conditions, then we immediately, as economists, think about trade-offs and challenges. To who? To central banks. Basically to your day-to-day operations. Trade-offs are going to be very simple. It's a very simple economic trade-off. It is about increasing or decreasing the monetary policy rate during recessions. Why that is a trade-off for you, but not a trade-off for the Federal Reserve Governor, Jay Powell, or European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde, is because in emerging markets, recessions are mostly coinciding with capital outflow episodes and also exchange rate depreciations. You can also view the same issue as a challenge as put by Helen Ray in her famous Jackson Hole paper in 2013. What is the challenge? The challenge is if I'm making policy with such trade-off, should I be thinking a framework of trilemma, the international economies trilemma, which tells me that floating exchange rates, independent monetary policy, and capital controls cannot go at the same time, or I should be thinking like dilemma, meaning even if I have floating exchange rates and even if I have independent monetary policy, I still cannot have capital mobility and I need to have capital controls, as she put it. So what we would like to, what I'm going to do in this speech, because this is something we are doing in several papers, and this speech is actually encompassing several papers, is what do emerging market central banks do? So this is a positive question, not a normative question, not an optimal monetary policy question. What are they doing? And let me say why this is interesting to ask this question, because when we started a series of papers in this future agenda, the consensus is that monetary policy is pro-cyclical, as the consensus on fiscal policy. I'm going to show you that actually this is not the case, and monetary policy is pretty much counter-cyclical also in emerging economies as in their counterparts in advanced economies. And then the second question here is, that is also interesting, does exposure to external financing conditions posing any challenges to central banks, and what are the most important challenges here? All right, I also have to say that I'm going to present a set of results from a different set of papers. Some of these papers are joined with central bankers and colleagues at the IMF, so the usual disclaimer applies. These are our own views, and I'm presenting you my views, and these are not the views of the IMF, its board, and also not the views of Federal Reserve and the other regional central banks in the United States. Okay. Is this a relevant debate academically? Yes. Is this a relevant debate politically? Yes. So this is a very highly relevant academic policy debate. I'm going to put 3 quotes here from 3 very influential people, both on the academic side and on the policy side, starting with Mike Woodford. He said, "I find it difficult to construct scenarios under which globalization would interfere in any substantial way with the ability of domestic monetary policy to maintain control over the domestic dynamics of inflation." This is going to be the one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is going to be Helen Ray, quote from her Jackson Hole paper. "The monetary trilemma is really a dilemma because open economies can exercise no monetary autonomy from the United States policy or, as she put it, the global financial cycle, unless they impose capital controls." And the in-between view would be Murray Opsfeld, a former chief economist at the fund. "An independent monetary policy is feasible for financially open emerging market economies, but it's limited in what it can achieve." I'm going to show you a broad set of results that will be mostly consistent with the last hybrid mid-view of Murray Opsfeld. Let me start with a quick summary. The first far-arching result here is that monetary policy is counter-cyclical in emerging economies. That means central banks in emerging economies, like those of the ones you work at and you do policy, lower the policy rate during recessions. That's the definition of a counter-cyclical monetary policy. We are going to show this in different sets of exercises, results, the different building blocks, but basically central bank in emerging economies adhere to Taylor type rules as in advanced economies. Policy rate is positively correlated with GDP growth, which shows you counter-cyclicality. Policy rate is also lowered around episodes of global distress and also when US monetary policy exogenously tightens. Then we ask, okay, so where is this consensus coming from in the literature that the emerging economies run pro-cyclical monetary policy? How do we end up with that result? I mean, when we started working on this, there's this extreme pushback from people saying, wait a minute, that cannot be right. We know that monetary policy is pro-cyclical. I mean, how do we know that? We start asking and digging. And it turns out that actually, not the policy rate, but the short-term market rates, they do deviate from monetary policy rate in emerging economies. In emerging economies, I'm going to show you there's this wedge between the short-term market rates and the policy rate, and that wedge is going to be counter-cyclical on average. And in that advanced economies, there is no such wedge. Because the short-term market rates, think like a 3-month treasury rate, that is going to mimic very closely the monetary policy rate, Fed funds rate. Also, this short-term wedge, what we call short-term disconnect between the market rates and the policy rate, is going to be heavily dependent on external financing conditions. What happens to those conditions, and this part links back to the global financial cycle, that if the global or external financial conditions tighter, then there's going to be even a bigger wedge, bigger short-term disconnect, meaning limited pass-through from the emerging market central banker policy rate to the market rate that the central banker is trying to affect first and foremost before going to the long-term rates. Okay, let me show you a result. Monetary policy rates in emerging economies. As I said, I'm going to show you the central bank reaction functions, oil less estimation of Taylor rules, correlation of policy rates with GDP growth, policy rates around the episodes of global distress, or as known as risk-off events such as global financial crisis, COVID episode, and also response of emerging market monetary policy rates to an identified US monetary policy shock. This is done now in the closed economy macro literature as these high-frequency surprises to US interest rates. We are going to use the same methodology, but if you are one of the non-believers in that methodology, I'm also going to show you results around taper tantrum, which is universally accepted as an unexpected and exogenous US monetary policy shock. Okay, so this is the Taylor rule. You can see on the left the emerging market economy. So the policy rate is regressed on the lag policy rate, inflation, and the output gap in emerging economies in the first column, and in advanced economies in the second column. You can see that these estimates are extremely similar, and they are implying Taylor rule coefficients that are also in the same ballpark. Both emerging economy central bankers and advanced economy central bankers raise interest rates with inflation, lower interest rate with, slack or when there are recessions. When you look at the dynamic correlation, so now the regressions is the one you see on the top, basically regressing or actually doing a local projection of the policy rates on the GDP growth and the lagged policy rate. So here you expect a positive coefficient over here plotted the business cycle frequency of 8 quarters if the monetary policy is countercyclical. Why? If the growth in the economy, if there is inflationary pressure, interest rate is going to go up. If there's recession, growth goes down, interest rate is going to go down. So that's a positive beta that is plotted here for both emerging economies and advanced economies. The sign is correct, telling you the monetary policy is countercyclical, but of course you see the emerging market line is below the advanced economy line. These are the same y-axes. And there are several explanations in the literature for that. One is the well-known fear of floating. The other one is the prevalence of supply shocks, commodity shocks for emerging markets. This is all fine. We are not saying these things are not there. Our point here is that in spite of all that, in spite of fear of floating, in spite of the commodity price shock, in spite of the supply shocks, emerging market central banks still do the right thing. They still run a counter-cyclical monetary policy. These are the episodes of global distress. On the top, you have global financial crisis. Again, on the left, emerging economies. On the right, advanced economies. You see the mean advanced economy and the median advanced economy, and the mean and the median emerging market are in the solid black and the dash black lines. So you see that everybody lowers the policy rates around global financial cycle. Of course, there are outliers in both cases. And in emerging economies, those top 2 countries that you see that are raising the policy rates are going to be Russia and Hungary. And then the blue you see in the advanced economy side, of course, famously Iceland. Now, the bottom is the COVID. Again, you see the same thing. Emerging economies and advanced economies lower the rates. Now, you can say, well, okay, COVID was a different shock. Sure. That's something we found out later. At the time of the event, here plotted March, April 2020, it was a very much a risk-off episode. It was a very much of uncertain shock. We didn't know what is going on. It was a recessionary shock, and everybody lowers the interest rates. And this is U.S. monetary policy tightening. As I said, this is an exogenous 1 percentage points impulse to U.S. monetary policy Fed funds rate, instrumented with the Gertler-Karadi high-frequency shocks. High-frequency surprises, this is basically the response over a tight window of the Fed fund futures. Many papers show this. This is not, shown first in our work. What you are seeing is when U.S. exogenously tightens the monetary policy, what happens in emerging market economies is a series of bad events. GDP growth collapses, first figure. Inflation goes up and down. Second figure, capital flows out. Third figure. These are shown in many, many papers. What is new here is all these bad things, lower GDP growth, higher inflation. Also, we show exchange rate depreciation, capital outflows, all the things that we associated with sudden stops that can happen as a result of exogenous monetary policy tightening happen in spite of the fact that emerging market central bankers lower the policy rate. That is the last window there. You see the policy rate is lowered. All right. What about short-term market rates? If this is all no difference, business as usual, both in emerging markets and advanced economies, so what is going on with the short-term market rates? Let's go over definition first. What is a policy rate? Policy rate is the target interest rate set by central banks in their efforts to influence the short-term rates. Of course, the goal is influence the yield curve and the long rates, but the first and foremost, you have to influence the short-term rates. That is the definition of the policy rate and your monetary policy strategy in any central banking environment. So the relevant short term here is going to be the short-term bond rates. Here we are going to use the treasury rates, as it's called in the US. You can call it government bond rates, but basically the rate government issues short-term bonds. I'm literally talking about short-term bonds. So please do not think about default risk or anything like that. This is a 3-month rate. 3-month treasury rate, 3-month government bond rate, widely available for a large set of advanced economies and emerging economies. We are going to use that. What happens to those rates? you can see that those rates also go up in advanced economies. This is the figure on the right. So the blue is the policy rate I showed you before. What is the regression here? What is the local projection? What happens if there's growth? If there's growth, the policy rates goes up, blue. If there's growth, market rates goes up, the red. That's the advanced economy. You see the policy rate and the market rate, short-term market rate, blue and red is exactly the same thing. Now look at the left, emerging economies. The policy rate is again counter-cyclical. Blue shows in both figures the monetary policy is counter-cyclical. With growth in the economy, you know, the policy is tighter. But look at the red in emerging economies, it goes down. So there is this disconnect between the short-term market rate and the policy rate. And this is pretty persistent. You see several quarters. Again, it's 8 quarters plotted here. So this is going to be extremely important then, which rate you look at when you are assessing the cyclicality of the monetary policy in emerging markets. This says you cannot look at the market rate, because market rate is going to give you the result that monetary policy is pro-cyclical, which is not, based on the policy rate. Now, obviously, if you difference the blue line and the red line, there's zero. Advanced economies, there is no short rate disconnect. There is no short rate wedge. That's why you see the zero line on the right. But look at the emerging economies. There is this short-term wedge, which what we call short rate disconnect, and that's a counter-cyclical wedge in emerging economies. And it's completely non-existent and acyclical in advanced economies. What about US monetary policy tightening? As I was showing you before, again, the bad things like GDP growth going down, capital flow going out, they are the last 2 figures. The first figure is what I showed you. When US exogenously tightens the monetary policy, the policy rate goes down. In emerging markets, central banks do the right thing because there's a recessionary impact in their economies. But look at the market rate. The market rate in red goes up, okay? This is the domestic market rate, it goes up. Okay. And this is also the result shown in my Jackson Hole paper in 2019, both the policy rate and the market rate result as a response to the US monetary policy tightening. What about taper tantrum? Taper tantrum is an exogenous, unanticipated US monetary policy tightening. You see that policy rate all goes down with the 2 exceptions, and these are Indonesia and Brazil. If you look at the IMF Article 4 documents, they are on the record, both Brazil and Indonesia, that they do want to rate during this taper tantrum. They raise the rate during the taper tantrum episode because of the capital outflows and exchange rate depreciations, but just 2 of them. Everybody else lower it, which is when the market rates are going up in the red. And you can see then the short-term wedge is going up for everyone, all the emerging markets, during this taper tantrum episode of May 2013, and because the market rate is going up. Okay. Now, how do these things relate to external financing conditions? So the external exposure or external financing conditions, we are going to use 2 measures here. One is just domestic banks' external liability share. How much domestic banks are borrowing from the rest of the world. Why do we use this measure? Again, I don't have to explain this to you, but the way I explain this to my American colleagues is, well, because domestic banks are the market makers in emerging markets. You talk to any emerging market central banker, that's what they're going to tell you. Domestic banks are very important. They are the market makers. They are going to hold a large share of government bond holdings, and they are going to be the relevant getaway for much of the external financing. With the rise of all the equity, portfolio, everything, non-banks, I'm going to show you numbers now. Still, the domestic banks in emerging markets are the leading getaway that brings the capital flows, the dollars to your economy and circulates them in your economy. So that's going to be our quantity measure. And the measure in terms of price, we are going to use an MB-SEMBI spread. We don't want a government spread here. That's why SEMBI is a better measure, the corporate version of that. But we really want a bank-based spread. So how much, you know, the domestic banks in Colombia, domestic banks in Mexico, domestic banks in Turkey pay over what, you know, Bank of America borrows at or JP Morgan borrows at. That's what we want. We want, this is not a very readily available measure. We started collecting this data, and in the revised version of our paper, we show some, and there is definitely this wedge. But basically, this is going to give us these external finance conditions on the spread side, on the financing side. Remember, this is very short term, and how much the domestic banks borrow is going to give us on the quantity side the external exposure. Some facts here, which is going to be about home bias, with all the integration of emerging markets into global finance, still there's going to be home bias, meaning domestic investors are going to hold most of the debt. So what you known as a 60-40 portfolio. So 60% of the debt is going to be held by domestic banks or non-banks. So here I'm giving you numbers for sovereigns because this is very hard to do this for all sorts of bonds. But for corporate and sovereigns, BIS did this. So 61% of everything held domestically, actually, where foreign investors holding 39%. You see the breakdown there. And here there's like some important detail where for the external part, non-banks are going to be important, of course, more and more, especially for sovereign. But that's going to be in local currency. So that's going to be in liras, pesos, and all that, right? In reals, when they invest in these bonds. So the banks are still going to be the getaway for dollars and euros, even when they are lending to your domestic corporates, domestic households, because they are going to be borrowing in dollars, which is going to be relevant for us. Okay, here's some numbers from a recent paper by Fang, Hardy, Lewis, and Hardy and Zhu that shows you a cross-section of all the emerging markets and the time series. You can see how much domestic banks are holding government bonds here. The EM average is going to be around a third, where advanced economy average is less than 20%. And over time, actually, especially when you look at, you know, the resident banks, the domestic banks, not the foreign banks, this is the top blue line, it goes up, not down. And when you look at the lender side, so the first figure here in pink, blue, and yellow is how much the sovereign in emerging markets, how much banks in emerging markets, and how much corporates in emerging markets borrow in terms of the entire external borrowing. This is as of 2022. It's very recent. If you look at this historically, obviously, banks are going to have a much larger role than corporates. But sovereign is always going to be the largest, right? Sovereign external borrowing is always the largest in emerging markets, as you can see here. Now, the mid figure and the last figure tells you, okay, in what type of instrument they borrow and what type of lenders are the lenders. So this is now focusing on banks and corporates, right? Because that's what we want to focus here. This short-term market rate is the rate that is relevant for banks and corporates. So when you zoom in the blue and yellow in the first figure, in the second figure, and you know who are the lenders of these banks and the corporate external lenders, you see that they are other banks. That's this large blue part, other investment debt, and the little yellow part is portfolio. I'm showing this to you because I know you are very well aware of this, but this point is now getting completely lost in the literature. There is this sense that it is everything about non-banks. There is this rise of global non-banks and portfolio flows and all that. Yes, of course they are rising, but when you look at in terms of shares, which is what is relevant for domestic policy making, this is still very small for emerging markets. The last figure is again zooming in now on that little yellow part on the top, that how much banks and corporates in emerging markets borrow from the portfolio guys. Who are these people? Who are these guys that lend in terms of portfolio? You see that large part is going to be other lender, this striped brown part. Those are going to be these hedge funds, mutual funds, all those guys, all these non-banks. But look at the green. So even in that little portfolio, banks are relevant, okay? Which goes back to this sense of banks are really the market makers in emerging markets. Okay, so then we do a regression. We take the short-term wedge. The left-hand side here is the market rate, 3-month bond rate minus the monetary policy rate. We regress this short-term wedge on the external premium, this short-term SMB wedge, or MB, which then becomes a little bit longer term, external premium, and the external exposure, which is the share domestic banks borrow from foreigners. Okay, so this is what is called, of course, the non-core liability share of domestic banks. You see that both variables come strongly positive, even when they use together, and even when they use together with a month fixed effect. This is the last column. Month fixed effect is absorbing all the global financial cycle of common things there. Even with that, you see positive coefficient on these variables, meaning if you're a country that pays a high external premium and where your domestic banks borrow a lot outside from foreigners, then you are going to have a bigger short-term disconnect, a bigger wedge. Okay, let me come to Latin America. So first, I'm going to show you this short-term disconnect with Latin American countries only. So this is the same figure. You see, you cannot even deduce with your eyes a difference. So the line here, he says, it is just not all emerging markets, but Latin American countries. The other emerging markets drop. You see, again, advanced economies are the same set. It is there for comparison, but even the magnitudes are very close, right? You see the same countercyclical policy rate and the, pro-cyclical policy rate, which means countercyclical monetary policy, and the market rate going the opposite direction. So when things are good in the economy, monetary policy is tight, that's the blue. When things are bad in the economy, monetary policy is loose, but then the market rate, the red, goes in the opposite direction. But we also did, so this is now, again, Latin American countries. What about the fact that there isn't just a single monetary policy rate? There are very different frameworks of monetary policy making. And this is, of course, true for all the developing economies and all the emerging markets. But especially maybe Latin America, there are clearly a lot of inflation targeters, but there's also interest rate policy framework, and there are some others. So we look at these differences, and you can see that regardless of what you do, say, let me just look at inflation targeters, let me just look at interest rate policy framework, you always see in the first figure that the policy rate moves in a way that monetary policy is counter-cyclical, regardless of your monetary policy framework and the rate, right? And also, accordingly, in the right figure, you see this disconnect, right? The difference between the market rate and the monetary policy rate, regardless of the monetary policy framework, is going to be this short rate disconnect that is counter-cyclical. And the black line there is the average I showed you before, where the blue is going to be the inflation targeter. In fact, inflation targeters show even a bigger and deeper, more counter-cyclical wedge. You can see with the blue, all the dashed lines are the standard errors, and then the red is the interest rate policy framework countries. Okay, then we, kind of group countries by level of external exposure. What does it mean? So the countries that pay an external premium over the median and below the median. Okay, below the median is blue, over the median is red. That's the first figure. And then, that's the second figure, by premium. And the first figure is countries whose domestic banks borrow much more from foreigners over the median, that's the red, and much less from foreigners, that's the blue. Okay, so you see, actually, the more exposed you are to external conditions by borrowing, the red and the first, and by higher premium, again the red, on the right, your wedge is deeper, countercyclical is deeper. So the more you are subject to external conditions, either through your domestic banks, large foreign borrowing, or the premium they pay, you are going to suffer this short rate disconnect more. Okay, can I write down a simple model to explain this, why this is happening? And the answer is yes. I'm going to show you the simplest model you can think of. It's a partial equilibrium banking model, literally one page. And it's just to make the point that you can, of course, think very elaborate frameworks, but even a very basic, three-equation, simple partial equilibrium model can actually give you these facts. It's going to be consistent with these facts that I showed you. Domestic banks in emerging economies, partial equilibrium. So there's going to be home banks, banks in Colombia. They operate in home currency bond market. They are risk neutral. The simplest assumptions you can have on the asset side, they are going to have these short-term home currency market bonds, and they are going to have a market rate on that. And on the liability side, they have, of course, liabilities to Colombian households, right? Domestic deposits, and those domestics pay the policy rate, RP, and then the domestic banks also have liabilities to foreigners, say American banks, and that's going to be a dollar rate, right? That's a dollar funding rate. So a key assumption here, and this is assumption in our model, this rate that domestic banks in Colombia borrow at, that R star hat, and you see it is country time variation, that is not equal to, you can see not equal sign to R star. R star is the worldwide safe dollar rate. So that's the 3-month US Treasury rate, what Bank of America pays when Bank of America is borrowing in the interbank market in the US and all that, okay? This can be endogenized. There can be several stories to do that. Bianchi and Lorenzoni have one, but here we say like, look, this is shown in the data that is not equal. There are models that endogenize it. Let me just assume there's this exogenous wedge there. Then I'm going to assume there's hedging. Why I assume that? Because this is for emerging markets, and we know that many emerging markets, after their own crisis, passed this regulation that domestic banks have to hedge their dollar exposure. If they are borrowing in dollars, they have to hedge that, right? The form can be different. You know, sometimes there has to be, all the positions has to be closed at the end of the week, at the end of the day, at the end of the month, but we all know very well that, you know, emerging markets have this regulation. So home banks are going to be hedging this foreign currency liability position to JP Morgan, to Bank of America, the Colombia banks at the forward exchange rate. Home banks, Colombian banks, are going to take the policy rate given, right, determined by the Central Bank of Colombia, and the dollar funding rate determined by the US also given, okay, as well as the spot exchange rate and forward exchange rate. All these exogenous things are going to basically make the model a partial equilibrium. Then you have very simple conditions. The bank balance sheet is going to look like the equation on the top. Bank profits, risk neutral bank zero profit condition, written as the second equation, with this omega term in line 2 in red, that tells you this is the share of foreign liabilities in all liabilities of Colombian banks. You see the exchange rate S there, spot exchange rate, converted to local currency. Now, this is going to give you equilibrium return on the home market bond, this 3-month government bond, RM, as a combination of these two things. One is the policy rate, and one is basically a forward spot adjusted, because the foreign liabilities hedge the rate that they borrow at dollars, right? And CIP here obviously holding to a first order approximation in these deposit rates. But look at that equation of RM. That says if that omega is 0, then your policy rate and the market rate is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. As long as there's omega that is not 0, right? And it doesn't have to be obviously 1, something between 0 and 1, something that says like part of your entire liability share as a domestic bank in Colombia is through foreigners, which is a positive omega, you are going to have this equation, equilibrium condition for the market rate. And that gives you the short-term wedge, right? So the last equation gives you exactly what I showed you in the data before, log linearized, so that's why now I'm going from big R's to small i's. So the market rate, IM, minus the policy rate, IP, is going to be a function of omega, which is how much my domestic Colombian banks borrow from foreigners, both in terms of a static average share and also time-varying share. And that's multiplied by what is the price, what is the rate I pay on that borrowing. That's the I star minus I star hat minus I star, both again as an average and as a time varying. So both the time varying external premia and the average external premia, and the time varying and the average foreign liability share of domestic banks are going to determine this short-term disconnect, short-term wedge. Okay, so basically that equation that tells you the change in the short-term wedge, or the short-term wedge is going to increase when external premium is higher, when the domestic Colombian banks and the Mexican-based banks borrow at a higher rate than Bank of America in dollars. Remember, this is all in dollars. And when the external exposure is higher, which means the entire liability, part of that entire liability is to foreigners and not just the domestic Colombian citizens. Okay, so that's what it is. This is, of course, a reduced form expression, so there is no causality claim here, but I have another paper joined with Julian De Giovanni, Mehmet Ulu, and Soner Başka in our stud that only uses data from Turkey, one emerging market, but shows this causally. Okay. So what is the friction here? So I already told you that there is this international borrowing wedge, right? The R star hat minus R star. But that means immediately, even the domestic banks are hedging themselves. So domestic banks in Colombia borrow in dollars. They hedge this dollar exposure. So in that sense, CIP holds for deposit rates. But there has to be a CIP failure somewhere, right? And that's the market rate. And that you see in the second equation on top. The first equation is CIP in the deposit rate that holds. The second equation is CIP, covered interest parity in the market rate, that doesn't hold. And why that doesn't hold is, again, that omega. You see in the denominator that there's this omega, again, this domestic banks foreign liability share. Why this is happening? I mean, basically, how do we think the arbitrage deviations, especially something covered, CIP is a covered arbitrage deviation, meaning if it is all about hedging, if everything is hedged, I shouldn't have this, right? But the way to think about it is not just if all your domestic banks in Colombia hedging their dollar exposure, but also if there's a single investor that can come to Colombian market and operate in the US market and completely get rid of this arbitrage deviation, right? If there is no such investor that is active in both markets with deep pockets, then you are going to have that. And that's exactly what is happening in emerging markets. You know, I'm not going to show you the details here, but we all know as emerging market central bankers that home banks can access short-term home bond market at different terms than the foreigners, right? There's a paper by De Leo and Keller and Zhu for Peru using very detailed data from Peru. They show this very clearly, explaining at length the institutional details of how these markets work in Peru, and that tells you, look, you know, it's JP Morgan and a domestic Peruvian investor, they don't operate. So there isn't a single investor that is just clearing these markets. Plus, I also have this other issue here that international rate is different. The Peruvian banks and Colombian banks are not borrowing at the same rate as JP Morgan and Bank of America in terms of dollars, right? So there is this country-specific dimension. And then the third one is the home banks are not 100% domestic household fund, right? I mean, this again is something that takes me a long time to explain in the United States, because that's the case in the United States, right? The domestic banks are funded by domestic deposits, but this is not the case in emerging markets. We all know that. So the bottom line here is neither home nor global intermediaries here. You can, you know, think here as all financial intermediaries, not just banks, but also non-banks. They cannot arbitrage away these CIP deviations across short-term, risk-free market bonds. Even the currency exposure is hedged. Yeah. To conclude, to exposure to global financial condition poses trade-off and challenges to central banks. Monetary policy stance in emerging economies is predominantly counter-cyclical. This creates challenges to monetary policy and manifested in time-varying short-term wedge between policy rates and the market rates. Why this is relevant? This is relevant for obviously everyone, but especially for countries, emerging markets and Latin American countries that has large external exposure and external finance premium. So this can be both shown in the data and can be justified with a partial equilibrium framework. You can also think a general equilibrium extension where these foreign funding conditions that I measure with domestic foreign liability share and domestic banks' external premium can be linked to country fundamentals, not just in terms of, very deep structural things like, patience, impatience, current account deficit, or fiscal deficit, and but also the credibility of monetary policy and uncertainty surrounding all sorts of country policies and policymaking. Thank you.